The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TechGig webinar series, our endeavor to empower techies. We believe that sharing of knowledge is the key to enhance our skills and grow us as professionals. With this principle in mind, we have initiated a series of webinars conducted by industry experts to give you all a crisp insight of various domains. The topic of today's session is Microsoft Project Series, Don't Kill Your Schedule by Setting Dates. Our guest speaker today is B. Sai Prasad. He is the Senior Manager, Learning and Development with Cognizant Technology Solutions. B. Sai Prasad, Senior Manager, Learning and Development, has been with service provider Cognizant Technology Solutions India Private Limited since 2001, where he was named winner of the company's Global Trainer of the Year award. He has trained around 80,000 plus practitioners on project management concepts, risk management, scheduling, estimation techniques, and Microsoft Office project tools. He is also working with Project Management Institute Education Foundation for promoting project management concepts for colleges. He has participated as a speaker, panelist in PMI REPs and chapters events. He is a certified PMP, PMISP, member of Associate Champion Advisory Committee, PMI India Champion Program, PMI India and Microsoft Certified Technology Specialist in Microsoft Project. He is the president of Microsoft Project Users Group, India Chapter, to promote and help practitioners within and outside India on Microsoft Office Project. He is also the editor of the project management book, Forecast Scheduling with Project 2010. So without further delay, I introduce you all to our guest speaker. Over to you, Sai.
Thank you, TechGig, and thank you for all the attendees who have joined this event. So as the event is titled, this is on Microsoft Project, and it's going to be a series of webinars at different points in time. So the topic of today's session is going to be on how to build a schedule that is quite realistic and dynamic. So I hope that most of you might be using Microsoft Project. So that's an assumption which I'm going to make before we move to the next step. So first we'll look at what are the common reasons why people start using Microsoft Project like Microsoft Excel, so that they are trying to lose an opportunity of creating a schedule which is having optimal and flexibility. So the key learning outcomes of this webinar would be surrounded on these areas. Number one, they explain the reason why people start entering dates. Then we will also look at what are the different constraints that are used when people start typing dates in Microsoft Project. We'll also look at what are the different constraint types that are available in Microsoft Project, when to go for and when not to go for those constraints. We will also look at the effect of these constraints on your critical path of your schedule. We'll also look at how to use the right constraint for the right activities, and when to go for deadlines rather than going for constraints. But first, let's understand what are the common reasons why people start typing dates in Microsoft Project. I hope some of you might be making this mistake, but you may not commit that you are making that mistake. But let's see why it happens. Number one, it looks quite silly. They say that we know the start date and the finish date of my activities, so why should I need a tool for calculating it? Number two, we'll also look at, they might say this activity should start on a particular date or should finish on a particular date, so they want to have control over those dates. The third common reason is they want an activity to finish on a specific date, or they have a quite not enough time to prepare a detailed plan, so they want to quickly create a plan. They start entering all the task information with dates quickly. And finally, they don't want project to calculate the dates. They should be the master and the tool should be the slave, and that's what people think. Okay, so these reasons looks quite good and quite realistic also. But when we are talking about a schedule should be a roadmap. It should be able to tell you in in clear terms when each one of your activities should start, when it should finish, and whenever there is a change in the scope of your project, whenever there is a change in your estimates, your activities date should automatically change. And that's what a schedule is more about. So a schedule can be seen more like a compass, which gives you whether you're going on the right direction or on the wrong direction. So before we talk about what is the effect of setting dates in Microsoft Project, we need to first talk about what we call as critical path. Okay, some of you might have heard about this term earlier. Okay, so let's take some time to understand critical path. Okay, critical path, as per the Project Management Institute PMBOK definition, they say critical path is the longest path in your schedule, and it also gives you the shortest time to complete your project. So when we talk about critical path in more detail, every activity in your schedule will have two sets of dates. One is called as early start, early finish. Another is called late start, late finish. If you have been using critical path method for a while, you might have known these definitions much better. So for the betterment of all attendees, I'm just going to move to Microsoft Project so that I can show you how critical path works. I hope all of you can see my Microsoft Project. So I'm using Project 2010. So you can find I have around 4 tasks, T1 to T4. I have some duration estimates. These dates have been automatically calculated, and I have some dependencies. So before we talk about the critical path in this project plan, I need to brief you on what are the assumptions I have made in this plan. Number one, if you look at this project plan, I have used a calendar where every day is a working day, which means even Saturday and Sunday are included so that you can know how these calculations have been done. Secondly, all these activities have been sequenced properly. So I don't have any dates attached. I just have said only after the first activity, the second and the third activity can start. Only after the second and third complete, the fourth activity can also start. So I have set some dependencies. And these durations can also be seen on the other side, just as a label. You might find what is the duration of these activities. But first, let's ask Microsoft Project, what is the duration of this project? So to know the duration, you can go to the Format tab. Okay. On the extreme right, you have an option called Project Summary Task. So let me select that. You can find the total duration of this project is set as 8 days. Now let's first find out how is this 8 days being calculated. So as I have told you, every task in this project plan is going to have two sets of dates. Early start, early finish, late start, late finish. So what critical path does is, for every project plan, it does a forward pass and a backward pass. In a forward pass, it calculates the earliest date when these activities can start. In a backward pass, it calculates the late start and the late finish of these activities. So to know where these dates are calculated and how these activities are scheduled, you might want to flip the columns that are shown on your screens. So first, I will go to the View tab. You have a button called Tables. Pull this Tables drop down and change it from Entry to Schedule. After you have changed it to Schedule, you can find we have a new set of columns like Early Start, Early Finish, Late Start, and Late Finish. So you can find for certain tasks, the Early Start and the Late Start will be same. For certain activities, the early start and the late start might be different. Why does it happen? Because there are certain activities that have some flexibility, which can start early or it can start late. But there are certain tasks that should start, and their early start and late start are quite same as per the forward and backward pass. So coming back to critical path are the set of activities whose total slack is 0. So wherever your early start and late start is same, your total slack is given as 0. Whereas if the early start and the late start are different, the difference between these 2 days are given as the total slack. So please note your total slack will ideally be a positive value okay, when your activity is not falling on your critical path. So in this example, T2 is having a total slack of 2 days. The remaining tasks are having a total slack of 0 days. That's very good. But now, how do I distinguish a critical activity from a non-critical activity? So if you just go back to the same format tab, okay, you can find we have a checkbox called critical task. Let me check that. You can find your critical activities that have a total slack of 0 is automatically highlighted in a different color. So those activities that have a slack of 0 will be shown in a different color. But you might wonder, why are we talking about critical path and how is this connected with our topic? It's quite connected directly when it comes to entering dates, and let's see why it is. So going back to the slides, we talked about what these dates are, and I gave you this idea. If you want to know the early start, early finish, or the late start, late finish of your activities, you can change your table to the schedule table. And the difference between these days is what we call as total slack. By default, project will highlight all the activities that have a total slack of 0 as critical activities. The last point which I would like to emphasize here is, as your project progresses, your critical path might change. Where a task is having a positive slack currently might be delayed, and it might have an early start and late start as same. So your critical path will move as you start executing your project. But now first, let's go back to the objectives of this program. How is setting dates or typing dates affecting your project plan? I think there are certain fundamentals you might want to know in terms of how a schedule is being prepared. Number one, when we talk about a schedule created in Microsoft Project, it can be done in two ways. One is called as forward scheduling, another is called as backward scheduling. What I mean by forward scheduling is, you know the start date of your project, but you don't know the finish date of your project. In those cases, your schedule start and your schedule finish of your activities will be same as your early start and your early finish. It's quite simple, right? Because you are moving forward, naturally you can schedule your activities only as per your early start and early finish of those activities. Or in other words, all the activities in forward planning will be scheduled as soon as possible. Whereas when I go for a backward scheduling, I know the finish date of the project, which means all my activities will be scheduled as per the late start and late finish of your activities, which means as late as possible. Okay. So people might ask, when should I go for what type? When is forward better? When is backward better? Remember, when you go for a forward scheduling, you need to know that your team will be busy every day when you go for a forward scheduling, because all your activities are starting as soon as possible. You may not have any buffer time because the moment an activity completes, the next activity should start immediately. You are not taking advantage of any slack left. But when you want to delay certain activities to a later point in time without disturbing the finish date of the project, then you might want to go for backward scheduling. Okay. So at any point in time when you have a question, you might want to post those questions on your questions tab so that I can take it at certain point in time. Okay. Yeah. So this is a hint which I have already told you. When you go for backward scheduling, your finish date does not move in your project. Now, what is wrong in setting dates? This is where the problem happens. Ideally, we will go to the start and finish date of your plan, and you will use the drop down or directly change the date. When you start changing the start date or the finish date of an activity, what project assumes is you don't want that task to start or finish any date earlier than the typed date. In the sense, on your screens you can find I'm selecting, let's say, 28th of May 2012, which means I don't want this activity to start before 28th of May, which means that even if its earlier activity is completing on the earlier month or the earlier week, this activity will not move ahead. Okay, so that's the problem in setting constraints. But now let's get into the details. What are the ways and how does it affect your schedule? So I'm just going back to my project plan. Okay, so we are back to the same project plan where we have identified the critical path. Now, I'm just changing my table back to the entry table. Okay, so let me give some time for the screen to be refreshed. Yeah, I hope all of you can see it. Fine. So I'm just going to pick this activity, which is T2. Okay, you can see there is an activity T2, what I have just highlighted. So I'm just going to change the date of that particular task alone. Okay. Now let's see what happens. I'm going to T2. Now currently this activity is scheduled on 3rd of May 2013. As you know, I've configured Saturday and Sunday also as a working day. I'm just moving this date 2 days late, which is 5th of May. Now just observe what happens in project, okay? So whenever you start changing the date, project doesn't like it. It says you are trying to move this activity to a future date, and it gives you 3 options. Number 1, move this task to the selected date and remove its predecessor link because T2 has been linked to T1. Number 2, move this task to the future date, but please respect the dependency. The third one, don't move this task, just ignore the last option what I made. So I'll go for the second option here, and I'll just say, okay. Now closely observe what happens to your project plan. So you can see that the selected date 4th of May has been set, and accordingly the finish date is getting moved. On the other side, you can observe this activity has been moved to a later date. So it looks good, right? But what happens now is for this activity, there is a constraint that has been put. If you observe on the extreme left, there is a small calendar indicator that has been displayed that this task has a start no earlier than on the selected date, which means even if T1 completes on an earlier date, T2 is not taking advantage of it. So without knowing what constraints are, people fall into a trap of changing dates either in the start date or finish date, which I will say, which is not good from a scheduling aspect. Okay. Now I'm going back to my presentation. So when we talk about constraints, right, there are 3 types of constraints. There are 3 categories of constraints which you might want to know. Number 1 is called as flexible constraints. Another is called flexible or the semi-flexible or the partially flexible constraints. And the third one is inflexible constraints. What I mean by flexible constraints, which means these constraints does not have any dates associated with it. For example, as soon as possible and as late as possible. We all know in a forward scheduling, all activities are scheduled as soon as possible. In a backward, all activities are scheduled as late as possible. So now let me go back to my project. So I'm just undoing the last change what I made. So I'm going to open the first activity T1 here. So you can find on the advanced tab of that particular task, there is a small drop down available called constraint type. Please note in this project plan I have done a forward scheduling. So all activities are scheduled as soon as possible. But if you can see the drop down, there are other types available like as late as possible and the other 6 constraints. So when you go for a forward scheduling, the constraint type will be as soon as possible, which means the moment the predecessor completes, the current activity will start as soon as possible, which means this task will be scheduled. The start date and finish date you see here will be as per your early start and your early finish. But when I say this activity should be scheduled as late as possible, naturally that activity will be scheduled using the late start and the late finish. Okay. Going back to the slides. The second type is called as partially flexible. What I mean by partially flexible, which means these activities have some kind of a partial constraint that it cannot start before a particular date, but any date after that is fine. Or it needs to finish not before a particular date, okay, but after any date is fine. So you can find that these types of constraints are of 4 types. It can be start no earlier, start no later, finish no earlier, or finish no later than constraints. So when you want to restrict an activity to start or finish not before or not after a particular date, you can go for the semi-flexible constraints. The last one is called as inflexible. It's more like a do or a die date, which means these activities should start or should finish by a given date. So an example of those constraints are must finish on and must start on. Okay. So this is a point which I've already highlighted, that when you start changing the dates in your Gantt chart, project automatically changes the constraint type to either start no earlier or finish no earlier. Start no earlier is set when you change the start date. Finish no earlier is set when you change the finish date of that particular activity. Now, what happens behind the scenes when you're setting constraints? This is a very interesting topic. So I'll just go back to my schedule. Yeah. So I'm just going to go back to our favorite table, which is the schedule table, because this table will list the early start, early finish, the late start, late finish of your activities. Yeah, I hope you can find there are a few columns like early start, early finish, late start, and late finish. Now, since all these activities are scheduled as soon as possible, the start and finish will be same as early start and early finish. But what happens when I start changing dates? So let me take the same example T2. I'm just going to change the date from 3rd of May to 4th of May. When you do it, you get this constraint alert. What do you want me to do? So I'm just going to use a second option here, that move the stars to that later date and keep that link. Now you would have observed there is a small shading that has been applied. Though the dates have changed, what internally you are applying is you have applied a start no earlier than. When I say start no earlier, which means the early start will be the date what you selected. So it is 4th of May and 5th of May is when it will complete, which means that the current start date and finish date of this activity will be same as early start and early finish. Okay. Similarly, when I am saying this activity, so let me add a couple of columns here so that it's quite easy to see the combination. I'll insert a column called constraint type, another column called constraint date. So you can find wherever we have as soon as possible, the date is not set. It's only for the second activity we have a start no earlier than. But when I say this activity, okay, as a start no later than constraint, okay, now let's see what happens. I'm still getting that alert, what we had discussed yesterday. I'll just say okay to it, which means this activity, okay, I didn't think I changed the date properly. 1 minute. I will just go for what we want. So now you find when you say start no earlier than, you can find your start date and your late start, right? The start date, what you have selected here is the constraint date, what you have selected is 4th of May. So that has been set as the late start, and accordingly the late finish is calculated, whereas the early start and early finish was the original dates. So you can find when you set a start no earlier than, this date has been used as the late start. But when you say start no earlier than, that date will be used as the early start. So as you can see, a very small change in setting constraints might try to shift the early start, early finish, or the late start, late finish to a previous or a later date. But when I say this activity must start on a particular date, when I say must start on a particular date, which means the early start and the late start will be same days. But as you already know, this was not falling on the critical path. But since I'm saying must start on, which means it cannot start before or later, which means the slack that is left, or the buffer time left in this case, is 0 days. So as you can see, setting or changing dates directly or setting constraints for some of your activities without having much knowledge about it might make your schedule more static and less dynamic. Okay. So these are the combinations you might want to think about when you're working on Microsoft project. Number one, when it is as soon as possible, your schedule start will be early start, schedule finish will be early finish. When it is start no earlier than, your early start will be same as the constraint date. If it is start no later than, your late start will be same as your constraint date. If it is must start on or must finish on, the early start, early finish will be same as your constraint date. So you need to know what happens behind the scenes when you are setting these constraints. So whenever you are using constraints, the one problem which we have already seen is you are trying to reduce the scheduling flexibility. But another common problem I have seen is they break the critical path. Okay, so I'll just go back to the project plan, what we created. Okay, I'll just show you the scenario now. So I've just defaulted all the activities to as soon as possible. I'll just change the table to the entry table so that we have. I'm just adding a new task in between T2 and T3. Okay. I'll just have it as new task and let me link those activities. Yeah, so I've just linked it, and I will just link the new activity. So I'll just do a small cleanup. Okay, so yeah, so I've just linked these activities. I hope you are able to find that the new task has been added. Let's see it. Okay. So you can find that your critical path is being shifted now. So it is T1, T2, the new task, and T4. So when you try to change the date, when you try to change the date for on an activity on a critical path, this is what happens. So I'm just going to change the new task date to a 2 days late. It's the 10th of May. So it will give you an alert that what do you want me to do. I'll just say move this activity but retain the link. But now what you find is, since this activity is having a start no earlier than constraint, which means the early start of this activity has changed to the selected date. Or in other words, when you look at your schedule, okay, when you look at your schedule, you can find the critical activity is having an early start as 10th of May, okay. Late start is 10th of May, so slack is 0. But if you look at T2, the early start and the late start will be quite different because there is always some amount of time left for that activity. So whenever you are changing or setting constraints for your critical activity, please do it with caution because there is always a chance your critical path might break. Okay. The next one which I would like to talk about is there are some times when your critical path, when your constraints might create a negative slack. I'll just show you when it happens. So I'm just changing the third one to as soon as possible. Okay. Yeah. So I'm just going to take the new task, what we have added, row number 3. Okay. For this activity, I'm going to say it cannot start later than a particular date. Okay. So I'll just say start later than. I'll just go for that date. Okay. I'll just change it here. Yeah. So you can find I've set a start no later than constraint for it. Okay. So what I do is I go to T1 or a T2. Okay. I'm just going to shift that particular activity to a later date, which means the duration of T1 or T2, I'm going to increase it. So let me increase it from 5 days to 7 days. So what you find now is, though your T2's finish date is getting moved, your new task start date and finish date is not getting moved because you have said this activity cannot start later than a particular date. So you can find there is a negative slack being created. What do you mean by a negative slack? Which means this activities or the activities that have a negative slack should start 2 days earlier. Okay, which means before the project start date, we should have started 2 days earlier. There is an option. The good news is there is an option in MS Project where I can say if there is a negative slack, please relax it. Just avoid that particular constraint. So you can go to the file, options, on the schedule tab, file, options, schedule tab. You can see there's a checkbox available which says task will honor their constraint dates, which means constraints are more respected than their dependencies. I'll just clear that option. Yeah. So I'm just going to say, okay now, just now observe what the total slack is. So you can find that this activity will be scheduled as per the dates what we have provided. So the point which I'm trying to emphasize here is make sure that you are trying to avoid constraints as much as possible. Okay. Now let's get back to the slides. So how do we ignore it? I've already talked about this. You might want to clear this checkbox saying task will honor their constraint dates. So what is the solution to it? Because sometimes we might say you would want to go for constraints because it's of a do or a die date. Rather than going for constraints, I would say go for deadlines. We have a feature available in project called deadlines. So I'm just getting this project plan. So I'm just removing the constraint what we have set to as soon as possible. So if I want an activity to finish by a given date, rather than changing dates, I can just open that particular activity. Okay. So in this case, row number 3, and I can say this activity should finish by this date. So I'll just copy that. Okay. And I will go to the advanced tab. On the deadline, I'll just do a paste. Oops. So I'll just open this again, 1 minute. Yeah, I just changed the deadline date to the date what we had. So I'll just say OK to it. So whenever you do that, I hope that you are able to notice it. There's a small indicator that is displayed on the extreme right. So it's not quite visible. You can see there is a small tooltip that appears on the extreme right. Say this deadline. To make it better, I might want to push it 1 day late so that you can quite easily see that. So you can find there is a deadline arrow that has been shown. What it means is if this activity or its predecessor is pushing this activity that exceeds the deadline date, you will get an alert. Now let's do it. So I'll go to T2, which is its predecessor, change it from 7 days to 9 days. So though the project finish date is getting moved, you can observe you have missed the deadline date. So you can see there is an indicator that is being displayed that this particular task goes beyond that deadline date. Okay, so this is a very nice option which you might want to use, but most of them may not know what the deadline or where to set it. So it's quite easy. You just open the task, change the deadline date to the date when you want this task to be complete. Okay. So when to go for constraints, I have already emphasized this point. Go for partial or full constraints when you have some activities that cannot be moved, some deadlines or constraints based on resource availability. Go for flexible constraints when you want to take advantage of the logic that is used by Microsoft Project and when you want to push your activities or pull your activities ahead of time based on the dependencies. So alternative constraints, I've already said, you might want to have the constraint type still as soon as possible with the deadline attached with it. So whenever you miss that deadline, you get that indicator on your screens. Okay, so I am done with my content. Okay, so just to take a quick recap of what we have discussed, we mainly focused on what are the reasons why people start entering dates. Then we looked at how to predict what constraint to be used in different places, differentiating different types of constraints and how does it affect your critical path, and when to go for deadlines, when to go for constraints is what we have talked about. And most of us, when we are using Microsoft Project, we use it more like a spreadsheet sometimes, maybe due to lack of time or lack of knowledge about it. So though you may not be able to master the complete tool, I would request you to make a note of certain important steps that will help you to make your schedule more dynamic always. Okay. So I'm open for questions now. So there are a few questions available.
Thanks for the insightful presentation, Sai. I request you to read out the questions and their answers so that all our users may listen to the insights. And are you able
Sure,
to access
I'll
the
do that.
questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I'll just take it one by one. Okay, the first question is there any REP ID that we can use to gain PDUs? Okay. This, I doubt TechGig is an REP, but I suggest you can claim the PDU for this webinar under category B. For category B, you don't need any proof. You just need a proof that you have attended this webinar, and an email proof from TechGig could be sufficient for it. So you can, instead of category A, you will go for category B, for which you don't need an REP ID. The next question we had from Mohammed is, so what is the best way possible to learn Microsoft Project? When you say best way, it's quite subjective, but I would say number one, you need to go in for a training better. It's always better that you go in for a proper training, okay? So that you are able to know the do's and don'ts, how Microsoft Project works. And there are a good set of YouTube videos available, and even during the year 2012, I did 10 webinars on Microsoft Project through TechGig. So if you can just do a search on Microsoft Project in TechGig, you can also go get those 10 videos where each video talks about different aspects of scheduling. You might want to use it. Can you suggest how to install Project 2010? I would say it's too late now because currently we have moved to Project 2013, which launched around 6 months before. The trial version is also not available on Project 2010, but you can install a trial version of Project 2013 so that you can try the features for 90 days, and then you might want to buy it. Okay. Yeah, okay. I missed a few points while writing. Can I get the PPT or PDF after the webinar? Yes, it will be available through TechGig. I'll be sharing it to them. Maybe they will circulate it. And this is going to be recorded anyway, so you might want to play it back for your own reference.
Yes, they can access it on our
We have
website,
another question.
techgig.com. It would be uploaded by
Oh,
tomorrow.
Okay, thanks, ma'am.
You're most welcome.
Next one, how do the constraints applied when we have multiple resources assigned to this project and we have one resource assigned on two activities, example, the same resources assigned to T2 and T3? Okay, see, constraints are more with respect to activities. So if a task is being assigned if a same task is being assigned to more than one resource, constraints act the same way. Because constraint is going to affect the task start date, which means even the resources will be forced to work on the due dates. So as an example, I'll just go back to my project. So in the current project plan, I am not assigned any resources for simplicity. So let me give some time for the page to come. I hope you guys can see that. Okay, now I'm just going to remove the deadline what we have added. Okay, so I'm going to have some resources. Maybe I'll say R1, R2, R3, R4, R5, R6. So if you look at the task 3, I have assigned it to two resources, R2 and R3, and I'm just changing the date. Okay, I'm just changing the date to 2 days late, that is 14th of May. So there is a constraint that will be shown. You can observe it. I hope you can see there is a date. So I'm just going in for the second option here, and I'll just go ahead. So this activity is now having a start no earlier than constraint. Now if you go to the view tab and you can do a split. So you can find on the bottom the task form will be displayed. You can find the task form being displayed that by default gives you only the resources who are assigned and what are the predecessors. You can just right click anywhere on the task form and change it to schedule. I hope you can find both the resources are now starting as per the constraint date what it has been. So constraint date cannot be applied at a resource level, it is more at a task level only. Okay. Now let me go back to the next question which we had. Okay. So I think, sorry ma'am, I think I closed the Q&A. Can you just get it back?
Yes, I'm just giving it to you.
I think I got it. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I got it.
Okay, not an issue.
Yeah, I'm having it. I just minimized. I was not able to find it, that one. Okay. Okay. With respect to the flexible constraints, in theory, as soon as possible and as late as possible constraints, don't they run the risk of keeping the schedule open-ended forever? If this premise is assumed, then when should these constraints be used? See, these constraints should ideally be used when you want to take advantage of your slack available on your early activity. So for instance, if you are using as soon as possible, and if the earlier activity completes much ahead of time, naturally you want your successor to start early. So I'm not trying to recommend that at a project level all activities should be as soon as possible or as late as possible. It is subject to what that task is. There are certain tasks where you might want to have a constraint. There are certain activities which you want to start as soon as possible. But don't always have all activities as soon as possible. Why? Because when you say as soon as possible, as you can see on your screens on the MS project, you are trying to keep your team busy every day in the project because you can see parallel work is being done every day. And even if you have some unplanned activities in your project, you cannot use any of the resources because they are already occupied on committed jobs. So you might want to plan your project plan, okay, in terms of which set of activities can be delayed without affecting your project, which activities should start only after a particular date, and accordingly you might want to do it. But I may not say it will create an open-ended schedule. You can always have a deadline for the project finish date, and whenever your deadline is getting pushed, okay, whenever your project finish date goes beyond your deadline, you will automatically get an alert, which we discussed, a red color alert. So that will tell you whether you missed it or not, and you might want to compress your critical path also. Okay, so that answers Abhijit's question. The next one is the link and the calculation automatically, or do we need to link the task specifying T2 as the predecessor? Yeah, that should be done, okay, because otherwise project will assume. So if I go back to my project plan, and if I just remove all these okay, so you can find all your activities will be scheduled as per your project start date only, okay. So only when you set dependencies, okay, project will calculate the date automatically. Okay, so that answers Muhammad's question. The next one, please explain how to track the schedule. Vijay, that might be a very detailed topic, but just to give you a brief, before you do percentage complete, you need to ensure that your project plan is being baselined. Okay, so that's a new topic by itself, but just to simplify it, I will just say the first two activities have been linked. Okay, you can find the first two activities have been linked with each other, and I need to first set my baseline. Okay, so let's so to set the baseline, make sure that you go to project, set baseline, set baseline. So the reason why we do a baseline is even before you start working on your project activities, you need to have an approved estimate. You need to have a benchmark based on which your project is going to be measured. So now I have set a baseline. On the right, I can say I want to see the baseline data. So you can see there is a black color bar that will be visible below all these activities, which means the baseline start and baseline finish of this activity set. So if you want to do tracking, you can just change the table to the tracking table. So go to view tables tracking. So you can find there are a new set of columns being displayed where you can start recording the actual start and actual finish. So when I want to say the first activity is 50% complete, but it started 1 day late. So you can see on the other side, the first activity, the second activity will be shifted by another 1 day. So now, by comparing the baseline with your current plan, you can know what your variance is. Okay, so that answers your question. How do we, okay, how the other constraints like finish to start impact the overall schedule? Yeah, it will certainly impact. So if you look at your entry table, so let's take the same example. Maybe I'll just try to hide some details. So when you say these two activities should have a start to start, I'm just trying to change the predecessor to 1 SS. So you can find the moment the first activity starts, the second activity will also start simultaneously. Whereas when you say finish to finish, only when the predecessor finishes, the successor can also finish. Okay. So naturally, the most commonly used is finish to start, but the other dependencies will drive either the start date or the finish date of your successor. We had one more question. Okay, yeah. Should we always have a calculate project as checked? Yes, we should do that. I think you are talking about the options, because if you have the calculate option checked only, the dates will be calculated automatically by project. Okay, so I would say if you don't check it, that will be more of a disadvantage than of an advantage. If the project is running in 2 different countries, how do we configure calendars for geographies? Yeah, so just to give you at a high level, I can say go to project, okay, and you can find there is a change working time option. So here you can configure the different geographies. So currently you can see on your screens, I've selected the change working time. the dialog box that is being displayed will tell you the standard calendar. So for the standard calendar, currently I've said Saturday and Sunday is also a working day. So you might want to create a new calendar for every geography, and you might want to link it to the resource what you have created. Okay, and yeah. Theoretically, when should we go for, I would not say theoretically, let's talk about practically. I would say practically you will go for flexible constraints when you want to schedule your activities earlier, otherwise other constraints will work good. Okay, yeah, are there any email alerts facility available for a person? No, that's not available in the standalone version of project. How do we find the scheduled performance? Yeah, I've already baselined this plan. So if you want to look at the performance of the plan, you can always change the table to the variance table. So I'm just going to the view tables variance. So you can find it compares your current start finish with the baseline start and finish, and the variance will be displayed here. Okay, so I would strongly recommend that go to TechGig after the webinar, do a search on Microsoft project, because you can find that there are a good number of sessions, webinars I did 1 year back on different topics what you have highlighted. If you want a specific topic to be covered in the future ones, just go back, write an email to me. My details are shown on your screens now. Okay, so you can always write back to me with any queries or what topics you are interested in future, so that I can plan it accordingly and do a webinar for you. Yes, Radhana, I've done my point.
Okay, you have summed up the session quite well today. I hope people reach out to you whenever necessary. So I'm really thankful to you for conducting this wonderful webinar, and it was indeed a great session. I would also like to thank all our participants for their support in making this webinar a success. The recording of the webinar will be available on techgig.com by tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Sai, for all your
Thank you,
time.
guys. Thank you, ma'am.
Have a great evening ahead. Bye-bye.